The dungeon had never been the kind of place you'd expect to find a human. Well, a human alive anyway. Maggots, skeletons, and things that shouldn't even exist lurked in the dark corners of the stone labyrinth, their eyes glowing like hot coals. This particular dungeon had become infamous in the galactic network, not for its traps or creatures, but for the unusual anomaly it housed, a human. And it wasn't just any human, this one had been in the dungeon for years, surviving against all odds, and, even more bizarrely, was thriving. The stories about the human from a dungeon were enough to make seasoned adventurers from every corner of the galaxy reconsider their choices. It was on a foggy, moonlit night that a crew of space pirates found themselves standing at the dungeon's entrance. They'd heard the rumors, the whispers that the human, had managed to make it all the way to the dungeon's deepest levels, where treasures lay, just waiting to be claimed. What the hell is a human doing down there? The captain of the pirate ship, Zornax, growled under his breath, his reptilian eyes scanning the dark maw of the dungeon's entrance. His clawed hand gripped the hilt of his weapon, a blade designed for slicing through flesh and bone, though he didn't know whether he'd be using it to slay or to defend the human. Beside him, his second-in-command, Kayla, a cyborg with a patched-up, humanoid frame and a sharp mind, narrowed her glowing red eyes. Surviving. And if the stories are true, it's one hell of a survivalist. We need him if we're going to reach the treasure. Zornax was skeptical. Human survival instincts were nothing compared to the deadly prowess of an experienced pirate crew, but there was something strange about this human. He wasn't just surviving, he was said to have made it to places that no living being, not even the dungeon's most ruthless monsters, dared approach. A human against all odds, outwitting even the deadliest traps. The door to the dungeon yawned open with an ominous creak, revealing a long, dark corridor that smelled faintly of decay and old magic. Zornax motioned for his crew to follow, his sharp claws tapping against the stone as they entered. We'll split into teams. Kayla, you take the left, I'll take the right. If we find the human, we'll deal with it. We're here for the treasure, and nothing else, Zornax barked, his voice low and commanding. Kayla didn't argue. She had her own reasons for wanting to find the human. If he really was as skilled as the stories claimed, he could be the perfect asset to the crew. The pirates had enemies on every side, and a human with that level of survival instinct might just be the key to evading capture by the Empire or dealing with rival pirate factions. As Zornax moved further down the right side of the dungeon, the corridor seemed to stretch forever, the stone walls coated in layers of moss and strange, bioluminescent fungi that provided the faintest light. The deeper they went, the darker it became, until the only sound was the clinking of boots against stone. His thoughts wandered, and for a moment, he wondered what it was like to be human, fragile yet clever, weak but relentless. The universe was full of strange contradictions, but this human? This anomaly made no sense. It wasn't long before they reached the first major trap, an elaborate network of pressure plates and spiked walls that could crush an adventurer into nothingness in mere seconds. A series of flashing red lights and a low rumble shook the floor, signaling the imminent activation of the trap. Watch your step, Kayla warned, her voice crackling through the comms. Zornax nodded but didn't flinch. He had survived far worse, and these traps were child's play for someone of his skill. He carefully studied the pressure plates, calculating the sequence with his quick mind. However, before he could move, something strange happened. A low, almost melodic whistling noise echoed from deeper in the dungeon, a sound that had no business being there. It wasn't the sound of wind or trickling water. No, this was different. It was a pattern. Almost as if someone was deliberately making noise, guiding them. Zornax froze, his ears twitching. It wasn't the usual dungeon denizens, this had to be. There was a rustle ahead. A figure appeared in the shadows, tall, humanoid, but with movements that defied all logic. The human. The figure stepped into view, illuminated by the flickering bioluminescence. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothes that appeared to have been cobbled together from scraps of fabric and leather, primitive yet effective. His face was thin, pale, and scarred from what could only be years of harsh dungeon life. But his eyes, those were sharp, alive with an intensity that made Zornax's skin crawl. Well, well, the human said with a grin, his voice almost playful. You finally made it. What took you so long? The pirate captain's heart skipped a beat. There was no fear in the human's voice. No hesitation. If anything, there was amusement. This was a dangerous creature, one who had made this dungeon his own. Who are you? Zornax growled, tightening his grip on his weapon. What do you want from us? The human chuckled, a low, eerie sound that echoed through the corridor. I don't want anything from you, lizard. But you might want something from me. He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the group. I've seen many of your kind. You're not the first to come looking for treasure. But, you're probably the first to get past the traps without ending up as a puddle of flesh on the floor. Kayla, her metallic arm glowing faintly, spoke up. You're the one they've been talking about, aren't you? The human who's survived the dungeon all these years? The human gave a nonchalant shrug. Survived? I've mastered it. Zornax's instincts screamed that something was off about this situation. No human should be capable of surviving in a place like this. No human could outwit the ancient and deadly mechanisms of the dungeon. Yet here he was, alive, standing before them, seemingly unfazed. Mastered it? Zornax's voice was a low hiss. You really think you can control this place? I've seen what this dungeon does to people. I've watched it break them down, turn them into nothing. Even the strongest fall. The human's lips curled into a wicked grin, one that sent an unexplainable chill up Zornax's spine. I'm not the strongest. I'm just the one who learned how to play by its rules. Before anyone could react, the human turned and began walking deeper into the darkness. His every step seemed deliberate, confident, as if he knew the exact path to take. He didn't look back. Come on, the human called over his shoulder. If you want to survive, you'll have to keep up. The dungeon's only going to get harder from here. And with that, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving the pirates standing in stunned silence. Zornax exchanged a glance with Kayla. This wasn't a simple treasure hunt anymore. This human, this anomaly, was something far more dangerous than they could have ever anticipated. As the crew trudged deeper into the dungeon, the atmosphere seemed to change. The air grew thicker, heavier, as though the walls themselves were alive and watching. Zornax kept his eyes trained on the human ahead, his every step calculated, his instincts honed after years of navigating deadly environments. The human, by contrast, moved with an ease that made no sense, almost like he was part of the dungeon itself. Where are we going? Kayla's voice crackled over the comms, her cyborg optics scanning for any signs of danger. The human didn't answer right away, his footsteps barely making a sound on the damp stone floor. His confidence was maddening. How could anyone survive here for so long, let alone thrive? You don't ask the dungeon where it's going, the human finally said, his voice calm and almost amused. It leads where it wants to lead. Kayla muttered under her breath, frustration seeping through her words. Great. We're following a madman into a death trap. Keep your eyes open, Zornax growled, his claws flexing. He might be our ticket to getting out of here alive. They had been walking for hours, or maybe days. Time had lost meaning in the labyrinthine maze of corridors and traps. Every now and then, they'd pass a chamber filled with strange, glowing crystals that hummed with an eerie resonance. The farther they went, the more unnatural the dungeon became. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and whispers, voices, echoed through the passages. It wasn't just the dungeon. It was something else, something deeper. What's happening? Zornax asked, his voice tense. The human didn't look back. You're hearing it now, aren't you? The dungeon speaks to you, too. It doesn't let you forget you're here. Kayla clenched her fist. So, what? This thing is alive? The human stopped abruptly, raising his hand in a gesture to silence them. Not alive in the way you're thinking. It's something else. Ancient. Its purpose isn't to kill, though that's what it does. Its purpose is to test. Zornax felt a flicker of unease. Test what? Everything, the human said softly. And it tests you with your own weaknesses. It doesn't care if you're strong, or skilled, or smart. It cares if you can break. If you can lose yourself here, it wins. That's comforting, Kayla muttered. Zornax stepped forward, his sharp gaze never leaving the human. So, you're saying this place chooses who survives? And you're the one who has learned to beat it. The human turned slightly, a faint smile curling his lips. Not exactly. It's not about beating it. You can't beat the dungeon. But you can learn its rhythm. Its patterns. You can bend it, for a while. You can outlast it. The human began walking again, and the pirates reluctantly followed, their weapons at the ready, but their nerves on edge. They couldn't deny it anymore, their plan had shifted. This wasn't just about treasure anymore. The human, who had lived here for so long, knew something they didn't. And if they were going to make it out alive, they needed to understand what that was. They rounded a corner, and before them stood a massive, open chamber. The ceiling stretched high above them, and the air was thick with tension. The stone floor was slick with some kind of black liquid that shimmered ominously under the faint glow of the fungus. In the center of the room was a pedestal, adorned with strange symbols that seemed to shift and change the moment you looked away from them. Zornax's heart rate quickened. This was it. The treasure. It was exactly as the rumors described. The pedestal gleamed, and atop it sat a small, crystalline object, glowing with an otherworldly light. Kayla was the first to speak, her eyes narrowed with greed. That's it, isn't it? The treasure we've been hunting for all this time. The human stopped before the pedestal, his eyes scanning the room. It's not that simple, he warned. The dungeon doesn't give up its treasure so easily. Zornax stepped forward, his voice low and cautious. What do you mean? It's right there. What's the catch? Before the human could respond, the ground beneath their feet trembled, sending a sharp vibration through their bodies. A low, rumbling noise echoed through the chamber, and the walls seemed to close in. The symbols on the pedestal shifted, and the black liquid on the floor began to bubble and churn, as if something beneath the surface was awakening. It's a trap! Kayla shouted, her hand already reaching for her weapon. The human stood motionless, a look of grim understanding crossing his face. No, it's a test. Zornax growled, his instincts screaming at him to take action. He pulled his weapon free, but just as his claws touched the hilt, a series of glowing lines appeared on the floor, crisscrossing the entire room. Move, the human yelled, suddenly springing into motion. The lines on the floor snapped open like a trap, and the ground seemed to split, revealing a deep chasm beneath them. Jagged rocks protruded from the sides, slick with the same black substance that was now spilling over the floor. The air was filled with the sound of grinding stone as a massive mechanical creature began to rise from the depths, its eyes glowing an unsettling crimson. Kayla raised her weapon, firing off shots that ricocheted harmlessly off the creature's armored hide. What the hell is that thing? A test, the human said again, his voice unwavering. Just like I said. It's the dungeon's last challenge. But you can't defeat it with brute force. You need to outsmart it. Zornax felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He was a pirate. He was a conqueror. He didn't outsmart things, he destroyed them. But this wasn't a battle of strength. The dungeon had already proven that. This was something else entirely. And if he was going to survive, he was going to have to think differently. The creature roared, its massive claws slashing at the air, and the entire room trembled. The floor was beginning to crack, and Zornax's mind raced. He didn't know how much longer they could hold out against this thing. But then, he remembered something, the human. What do we do? Zornax asked, turning to the human, who was already moving, calmly and methodically, as though he had done this 1,000 times before. You have to survive long enough for the dungeon to reset, the human said, ducking as one of the creature's claws swung dangerously close. The dungeon only lets the worthy survive. If you can get past this challenge, it will open a path. The creature lunged again, and this time, Zornax was ready. He darted to the side, using his agility to avoid the blow. Kayla followed suit, her cybernetic limbs allowing her to move with deadly precision. But the creature wasn't the real threat. The real threat was the dungeon itself, and it was beginning to close in. The creature roared once more, its massive form blocking the exit with a single, sweeping motion. Its crimson eyes burned with a hunger that could only be satisfied by blood, and its razor-sharp claws scraped against the stone floor, leaving deep gouges behind. Zornax's heart raced in his chest, but it wasn't the creature he feared the dungeon. The very walls seemed to shift, their once stationary position now a constant motion, as if the dungeon itself was alive and breathing. The sound of grinding stone reverberated throughout the chamber, and the once distant rumbling now felt like it was coming from inside Zornax's own skull. This place didn't just trap you, it consumed you, mind, body, and soul. Zornax gritted his teeth, forced himself to focus. The dungeon's shifting walls weren't the only thing that made this situation a nightmare. The creature, a mechanical monstrosity, was no slouch. Its enormous limbs tore through the air with terrifying speed, each swipe carrying enough force to obliterate anything in its path. Zornax knew their chances of surviving through sheer strength alone were slim, especially considering the human's cryptic warning, "It's not about beating it. You need to outsmart it. Kayla, keep your distance." Zornax barked as he dove to the side to avoid another strike, barely avoiding being crushed by one of the creature's talons. "We need to find a way to disable it." Kayla, agile as ever, dashed behind a stone pillar for cover, her glowing red eyes scanning the creature. "How do we even start? It's too strong. We can't just overpower it." "We don't overpower it," the human said coolly, not a hint of panic in his voice. He ducked beneath a swing of the creature's claws, moving with grace that seemed to defy logic. "We outsmart it." Zornax's eyes narrowed as he observed the human. His movements were so fluid, so precise. He didn't seem to be afraid at all, and Zornax realized something unsettling. The human didn't just understand the dungeon, he had learned to speak its language. To read it. It was as if the dungeon's mind, its ancient intelligence, was somehow at peace with the human. Perhaps the human had figured out something no one else had. The way to survive wasn't about brute strength, but about understanding the way the dungeon worked. The creature lunged forward, its heavy footfalls shaking the floor. Zornax barely had time to react as its claws swiped down toward him. He darted forward, barely dodging the attack, but it was clear, if they didn't figure out a way to deal with this thing, they were going to end up as little more than a smear on the floor. "What do we do?" Kayla asked, her voice sharp with frustration. "We need a plan, now." The human's eyes flicked toward the creature and then toward the pedestal. "The dungeon doesn't care about your strength. It cares about your will to adapt. And the way to defeat this creature is to make it a part of the dungeon itself." Zornax's mind raced as he tried to follow the human's words. Make it part of the dungeon? How the hell were they supposed to do that? The creature wasn't alive, it was a machine, a weapon designed to destroy anyone who dared come close. "You're going to need to trick it," the human continued, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "The dungeon has rules. But it's not as predictable as you might think. It responds to its own logic. And this creature? It's part of that logic." The creature charged again, its massive form barreling down the corridor toward them, its claws poised to strike. Zornax felt the familiar tension in his muscles, the primal instinct to fight back, to slash and destroy. But instead, he forced himself to stay calm. He needed to understand the human's words. "Are you saying we control it?" Kayla asked, her voice skeptical but laced with a hint of curiosity. "Not control," the human said, taking a step back to avoid another attack. "Outmaneuver. The dungeon lets you manipulate its own systems if you're clever enough. It wants you to make it seem like you're part of it." Zornax's brain clicked. "It's a trap," he muttered, a cold realization sweeping over him. We have to make it think we belong here. We have to be part of the dungeon. Kayla hesitated for a moment, clearly processing the implications of Zornax's words. But how do we do that? The creature is too powerful. The human grinned, his teeth flashing in the dim light. You're looking at it the wrong way. The creature's power isn't in its size. It's in its pattern. You've seen how the dungeon moves, how the walls shift and the traps reset. The creature is just another part of that rhythm. Once you see that, it becomes predictable. Before anyone could ask another question, the creature lunged again, this time directly at the human. Without hesitation, the human sidestepped, grabbing one of the glowing crystals from the pedestal. The moment the crystal touched his hand, a pulse of energy rippled through the room, and the creature's movements suddenly faltered. Its body froze mid-lunge, as if its internal systems had been interrupted. Kayla's eyes widened. What did you do? I didn't control it, the human explained. I simply altered the way it interacts with the dungeon. Zornax barely had time to process the words before the ground beneath them shook again. The creature's frozen body began to crack, and the walls around them shifted violently. The entire chamber seemed to be reacting to the crystal. And then, the room began to move, the walls and ceiling rotating as the dungeon itself realigned. It's responding to the crystal, the human said, his voice barely audible over the rumbling. This is what I've been telling you. If you want to survive here, you have to adapt to the dungeon. Use its own rhythm against it. The creature's body jerked as it powered back to life, but its movements were sluggish now, disoriented. The glowing crystal in the human's hand pulsed with energy, and the once menacing machine seemed to lose its focus. The creature's steps were no longer sure. Its attacks were erratic, as if it were no longer fully aware of its surroundings. You see it now? The human asked, watching the creature struggle. The dungeon doesn't want you to defeat it. It just wants to see if you can keep up. Outlast it. Think of the traps you faced. If you can survive them, you earn the right to move on. Zornax clenched his fists, suddenly understanding the nature of this place. The dungeon didn't want to crush them. It wanted to see if they could adapt to its puzzles, its traps, and even its creatures. It wasn't about defeating what was in front of them. It was about learning how to survive its relentless assault on their minds and bodies. The creature swung again, but this time, Zornax was ready. He didn't try to kill it. He didn't try to overpower it. Instead, he dove beneath its swipe and pushed off the ground, using the shifting terrain to propel himself toward one of the creature's exposed joints. Kayla followed suit, using her agility to strike at its weak points, forcing it off balance. Every movement was synchronized, like they were part of a larger machine, responding to the dungeon's rhythm. The creature let out a final screech before it collapsed to the ground, its once ferocious limbs twitching as if its internal systems had been fried. The dungeon seemed to respond in kind. There was a brief moment of stillness before the pedestal began to glow brighter, its symbols shifting once more. You did it, the human said quietly, looking down at the defeated creature. You outsmarted it. Zornax exhaled sharply, feeling the rush of adrenaline begin to wear off. He wiped his brow, barely registering the fact that they had survived the impossible. You're right, Zornax said, glancing at the human. It's not about brute strength. It's about surviving the test. The human grinned again. Welcome to the dungeon, lizard. You might just have a chance now. The dungeon's heart thrummed like the pulse of some ancient, living beast. The stone walls, which had once felt like inanimate obstacles, now seemed to breathe in time with the rumbling of the ground beneath their feet. Zornax, Kayla, and the human stood at the edge of the chamber, the aftermath of the creature's defeat still hanging heavy in the air. The pedestal before them had stopped glowing, its energy now spent, but the echoes of the dungeon's presence lingered. Something had shifted within the dungeon, as though it had acknowledged their victory, and perhaps, their worth. Zornax couldn't help but feel the weight of that acknowledgement. The dungeon was far from a simple trap, it was an intelligent, ever-changing puzzle, and it had been testing them, not just for survival, but for understanding. And now, they were closer to solving it. We're not done, the human said, his voice steady. The dungeon doesn't give up so easily. But we've passed the first test. Zornax grunted, his mind still reeling from the battle. This thing never stops, does it? Not unless you know how to make it, the human replied, taking a deep breath. You've all learned how to adapt. Now you need to make the dungeon bend to your will. The more you understand, the more you can manipulate it. Kayla was looking up at the walls, scanning them with her cybernetic enhancements. There's no way this place is just going to let us leave. We need to finish this, or we'll be stuck here forever. Zornax's tail twitched as he looked at the shifting walls. The dungeon wasn't just a labyrinth of stone, it was a maze of perception, a puzzle wrapped in layers of danger and deceit. They had survived one test, but what if the next one was worse? What if it was something they couldn't outsmart? What do we do next? Kayla asked, her voice almost a whisper, as though afraid that speaking too loudly might make the dungeon hear her thoughts. The human turned, his gaze flicking between the walls and the group. We move forward. The dungeon tests you through progression. Each step forward is its way of measuring your resolve. But that doesn't mean we have to do it its way. Zornax tilted his head, narrowing his eyes. What are you saying? You've been here for how long, and you still don't know everything about this place? The human smirked, his eyes gleaming with something Zornax couldn't quite place. I know enough. The dungeon doesn't work the same way every time. But it does follow patterns. And right now, it's asking you to prove you can adapt. Before Zornax could respond, the floor beneath them cracked open, sending a wave of fear through the group. The stone split like the jaws of some great beast, revealing an enormous chasm below, swirling with mist and shadows. Move, the human shouted, grabbing Kayla by the arm and pulling her toward the edge of the chasm. The ground continued to tremble as the three of them ran, Zornax leading the way with his enhanced reflexes. The chasm seemed endless, its depth unfathomable. Below, they could see distant shapes, figures moving, twisting in unnatural angles as though the very gravity of the dungeon was warping their bodies. This is insane! Kayla shouted as she sprinted beside Zornax, barely avoiding another shifting section of the floor. Trust me, the human shouted back. We need to stay on the move. Zornax's eyes darted to the side, his mind working quickly as they barreled through the ever-changing terrain. There was no time to think. There was only time to react. They reached a narrow bridge of stone, suspended precariously over the chasm. The stones beneath their feet were crumbling, the bridge barely holding its shape. Kayla, despite her cybernetic limbs, hesitated. I don't know if we can. We have to, Zornax snapped, urgency in his voice. He surged ahead, propelling himself with a burst of speed. As he reached the halfway point of the bridge, the ground beneath his feet cracked. Zornax's claws dug into the stone, but the bridge was beginning to give way, the stones beneath him falling into the abyss below. With a roar of defiance, Zornax leapt toward the other side, his muscles straining against the weight of his own body. He barely caught the edge of the next platform, claws skittering against the stone. His heart was racing, his vision blurred by the adrenaline. He pulled himself up, rolling to his feet just in time to see Kayla and the human leap after him. The bridge behind them crumbled into nothingness, leaving them standing on a small, jagged ledge that seemed to extend into an endless void. The dungeon had been testing them. It had thrown them into an impossible situation and watched as they scrambled for survival. And for the first time since they had entered this hellish labyrinth, Zornax realized something. It wasn't the dungeon that was the enemy. It was their own doubts. Their own fears. The dungeon was showing them their own weaknesses, and forcing them to confront them. Every step forward was a chance to prove that they had learned, that they could overcome their own limitations. Are we really going to keep doing this? Kayla asked, breathless and wide-eyed as she gazed into the endless expanse beyond. We don't have a choice, Zornax replied, his voice grim. The only way out is forward. We've learned the tricks. Now it's time to see if we've got the strength to survive until the end. The human nodded, his expression unreadable. Exactly. But remember, strength isn't just about power. It's about being able to endure the impossible. You've all learned that. As the group continued to move forward, the dungeon seemed to shift around them, the air thick with the tension of their every step. They had come this far. But would it be enough? Zornax didn't know. But one thing was certain, the dungeon had tried to break them, tried to turn them into its playthings. And yet, they were still standing. They had survived every test, adapted to every challenge, and overcome every trap. And with every victory, they grew stronger. Kayla, Zornax, and the human moved on, their resolve as unyielding as the stone beneath their feet. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were conquering the dungeon's twisted challenges, each more impossible than the last. And one day, they would reach the heart of the dungeon, the source of its power. But for now, they kept moving forward. Because that was the only choice they had.